Thank you very much for coming today, everybody. Welcome to Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Red River Métis. You know, it's Truth and Reconciliation Week here in Manitoba and across Canada. And we're living in a time where there doesn't seem to be all that much truth, and reconciliation still has a very long way to go. And as Manitoba Liberals, we'd like to change that. All First Nations and all Indigenous Manitobans are Manitobans. Manitoba Liberals take the position that we have an obligation to recognize their full rights to fair and just treatment, and recognition that they're human beings entitled to human rights. Equal treatment is not special treatment, it's fairness. Making things right when someone has been wronged is not special treatment, it's justice. And we as a party are really serious about doing what it takes to reconcile. We have a very proud history of that. And I also just quickly acknowledge my colleague, Dr. John Gerard, who has been absolutely incredible on Indigenous issues ever since he was elected MLA in 1999. But it was a Manitoba Liberal government that elected the first woman MLA, Edith Rogers, in 1920, who was Métis. It was a Manitoba Liberal government that in the 1950s brought in the vote for all First Nations and provincial elections well before the federal government did. In the 1980s, Sharon Carstairs was one of the only political leaders in Canada to stand with First Nations and Indigenous people whose rights were going to be put at risk by a new constitutional accord, the Meech Lake Accord, which had been created with no input whatsoever from Indigenous people. The PC supported it. The NDP supported it. The federal Liberals supported it. But Elijah Harper, who finally killed it, had to defy his own NDP party and leader Gary Dewar at the time to vote against it. That was made possible by the initial opposition by Sharon Carstairs and the Manitoba Liberals. And we still have a very serious problem with the truth of history in our province and in our country, with accepting what happened not just in the past, but much more recently. Manitobans and Canadians need to understand that in Manitoba, it wasn't just the PCs who've mistreated First Nations, denied their rights, took their children, and denied their calls to justice again and again and again. It was the Manitoba NDP. And they did it the last time they were in government. And it hasn't stopped. Because there are lots of people who have problems with the NDP because they say they're socialists or left-wing or with their leader, when the real problem is their real record in government. Their record on things that are supposed to matter the most, like poverty, for which they did absolutely nothing for 17 years. Like the environment, for which they did nothing for 17 years. And for First Nations, when they made things immeasurably worse during their 17 years. Because the people who care about those issues when it's the PCs doing it seem to fall silent when the NDP do. And if you want the latest and clearest example, which I find personally troubling, it's the NDP's refusal to include a search of the landfill in their platform, which they released yesterday. In June, I sent a letter to Grand Chief Merrick and Regional Chief Woodhouse committing to a search. The Premier had not yet refused to do it. Why did we do it? Because it was obviously the right thing to do. That's about what major police investigations cost. That's how you're supposed to treat fellow human beings and grieving victims of crime. And the PC's policy, their willingness to use this as a wedge issue, is absolutely disgusting. They've lied, they've changed their story, they've lied again. When they say that it's not safe, they're lying. It's disgusting. And we're talking about families of murder victims here. The entire PC campaign must be like a kind of torture for them. It's inhumane. Imagine being one of these family members and having to listen to the Premier of this province posture and try to win votes based on denying your family justice. But the NDP have refused to commit. They've danced around this issue. They've said they'll work with families. But yesterday they released their full platform, and it makes no mention of searching the landfill. As a document, it makes commitments 174 times. It says, we will do this, we will do that. One of the things they're going to do, which they could find the money for, is to make tax cuts for billionaires permanent. But the NDP will not commit to the landfill. Why? It should be about doing one thing, the right thing. This should never have been a political issue, and I will say this, I've spent a lot of time as many of us here today have, looking into the eyes of people whose spirits and hope for justice have been broken. And the sheer cruelty of the NDP in giving false hope is part of what drives me. Because I know that we're the only party that has stood up and spoken up for children that have been brutalized by the NDP for years, and they want everyone to forget it. The Manitoba NDP's track record on First Nations, it is not just abysmal. It is by far the worst in Canada. We need to expose and address these, and that's part of what our platform is designed to do. We really are serious about addressing the harms of the past, the harms of the present, and frankly, the harms of the NDP. So we have a whole suite of commitments, and I'll run through them because these are policies, again, designed to address decades of injustice. You know, I love my province, I love my country, and I want this injustice and suffering to end so we can love it again for what it is and not some phony idea of what it is. And so here are our commitments. Our first commitment, which fulfills many of the first 5 calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which are related to children in care. We will return $338 million in federal child benefits that Manitoba Government illegally took from Indigenous children in the care of child and family services. This is a practice that began in 2006 under the NDP government of Gary Doer, who is currently endorsing Wab Kinew. The NDP never stopped taking that money before being voted out in 2016. And the Manitoba courts found the NDP and PCs violated the rights of those children year after year by taking them and by taking their money. The PCs are currently being sued for $1 billion. And at the First Nations Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs debate, with both Heather Stephenson and Wab Kinew avoided, NDP MLA Ian Bushy claimed the NDP would pay back this money too, but it's not in their platform. It's another deception. We've committed to funding the search of the Prairie Green landfill with an initial funding commitment of $42 million, which could increase as needed. The Manitoba Liberal commitment to paying for the search is as a matter of basic justice. This is a police investigation into multiple murders, and we must further restore confidence and trust for First Nations and other Indigenous Manitobans that the justice system works for everyone, not just a few. And while the PCs have campaigned against victims of crime by opposing this search, again, the NDP have made no formal commitment. There's a saying, show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities. There's nothing in this budget for the land search. We will return birth and neonatal care to Northern Manitoba with support for midwives and funding staffing and birthing center at dialysis for the Cross Lake Medical Center, Gerald's home community. Currently, the standard of care in Manitoba is to fly First Nations women to Winnipeg to give birth, which makes mothers vulnerable and increases the risk that that newborn will be seized by CFS. That's part of what we have to break. We will also invest in critical transportation infrastructure for First Nations communities, including the construction of an airport at Wasagamak, which has been promised for decades, but no party has ever built. We will ensure that highways, winter roads, and ice roads are properly maintained, and these investments will enhance safety and lower costs for these communities. We will create a government fund to establish long-term compensation for hydro-affected communities who have been incredibly damaged in the north. They faced utter devastation by hydro developments that destroyed economies on the PC's and the NDP's watch. There was a debate last night about this. Neither the NDP nor the PCs showed up. Only my colleague, Dr. John Gerard, did. This is something that people have been calling for decades, and the NDP and the PCs are offering nothing. We will also work to reduce the reoffense and reincarceration of Indigenous inmates with post-release supports and halfway houses for men and women. Currently, Manitoba incarcerates people at twice the national rate, and the vast majority are Indigenous, who have not been found guilty of anything. They are there on remand or on breach. That is why we have to make sure that they're given opportunities, given a roof over their head and opportunities for training. We've committed funds for the Clan Mothers Healing Village and Native Clan to ensure that people can get on a better path. We will protect vulnerable women and children with new emergency shelters in Winnipeg, Brandon, and Thompson, because Manitoba has one of the highest rates of violence against women in Canada, especially for Indigenous women and girls. And we will address homelessness as an act of reconciliation, with a plan to have same-day housing up and running by 2025. And again, this relates directly to the issue of children in care and the policies of the NDP with CFS. The majority, more than 50% of the people who are homeless on the streets of Winnipeg are Indigenous, and over 50% were once in the custody of Manitoba Government's CFS system. These are people who the NDP and the PCs took from their families, took their money, then abandoned on the street. That's the reality. Incredibly, oh, there's Nellie. Hey, how are you? And I have to say, this is another example of a complete failure on the part of the NDP. Their plan to end chronic homelessness is to do it 8 years from now. 8 years from now. We will also work in partnership and create an Indigenous Secretariat that will allow for ongoing consultations to reform provincial systems and guide the implementation of UNDRIP to ensure that First Nations have a say on resource development on their territory and many other rights, as every Manitoban should. We will make First Nations and Indigenous communities partners in fighting climate change by making them eligible for funding from our $300 million a year green plan, including rewilding and ecological corridors. We will work in partnership on economic reconciliation with First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, including sharing resource revenue and assisting Indigenous entrepreneurs through a Manitoba Business Development Bank. We will lift people out of poverty by modernizing social assistance, bringing in a provincial guaranteed minimum income for people over 60, as well as people with disabilities, including on First Nations. And we'll create a $150 million Manitoba Works for Good Jobs Fund that would help nonprofits, community organizations, pay for people to work in the community interest, including on First Nations. And I will say, it's often common for people to ask, how will we pay for this, what the numbers are? And there's a very common, and quite frankly tragic, misconception that First Nations are somehow paid better or get more money from government than others do. That is simply not true. And I'll tell you why. The Manitoba government receives billions of dollars in funding from the federal government, over $7 billion a year just this year, and that is per capita. It means the Manitoba government gets money for every single First Nations person on reserve, but they don't share it. They keep it. That's outrageous, and that has to change. So that is the bulk of that is the entire reconciliation plank of our platform. Our entire platform is written through the lens of reconciliation. And I'll just say the reason that we as Liberals care about Indigenous rights and First Nations people is simply that we recognize First Nations people as human beings. That's what Liberals do. And to the Indigenous people of Manitoba, from a settler, you have suffered while we have prospered. This has to stop. We can prosper and heal together. You have a choice in this election, you really do. And you do not have to hold your nose to vote for the NDP to get rid of Heather Stephenson. You can vote Manitoba Liberal and stop both. Now, I just want to call up my good friend, Robert Falcon-Millette, who's running here in Southdale. Ah, there he is. Look, I just got to say, and I'll very briefly, the reason I'm here today is because of Robert, in a bunch of ways. We worked together on his mayoral campaign when nobody thought we had a shot, because people were looking for change. And I learned a lot from him, and quite frankly, he renewed my faith in democracy and the fact that campaigns can change minds and change hearts. And he's been so encouraging, and I just want to thank him very much. Thank him for running for us, but also thank him for his leadership. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And all my relations, we are here on Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Anishinaabe, Nehiyaw, Dene peoples, the Dakota peoples, the Métis Nation, and this is also the land of the Inuit people in Manitoba, and we all live here together, and we should never, ever forget that. And this is part of what reconciliation is. It means about being authentic. And one of the things I think is most encouraging about the platform that we have put together is this idea of being authentic, true to oneself, is not hiding from the population and those, our fellow citizens, about what it is we actually intend to do. Because citizens can see through politicians when they're phony. When you arrive in front of the door and they ask you what you're doing, you say, well, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing this. But they say, well, that's not what you should be doing. This is what you probably should be talking about, because that is what we expect of you. And so I think it's important to have the courage in politics to stand up for what you believe in, to not hide about what you might be doing, because at some point these elections become so important. Now, Mr. Canoe may become the premier of our province. We should acknowledge that. But if he comes afterwards and he either doesn't advance reconciliation And just because you're Indigenous doesn't mean you advance reconciliation. Because reconciliation is far more than just one person. It's the people in the streets. It's the people in the homes. It's the people in all the communities across our province. And if he comes and he says, well, I'm Indigenous, and so reconciliation has been done. Well, that's not true. But if he also comes ahead and he starts doing things, and then the other groups in society say, well, you didn't talk about that. Why are you doing that now? That's expensive, or that's costly, or this is not what we expected. That it actually makes it harder for other Indigenous peoples who follow behind him to actually make the differences. And I think one of the things I've, when I was elected in 2015 in Ottawa, we were very clear about what we wanted to do. And I was proud when I was the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre to advance the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to have the opportunity of proposing private members legislation, getting the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the caucus on board, and now we have this day of getting CFS legislation. And I was there with Dougald, and people didn't believe it could happen. When I arrived in Ottawa, they said you should only focus on one little thing. And yet, we focused on CFS legislation at the federal level, and today we actually have it, where it gives control of Indigenous children to Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples. And here's the same thing in the province, but it has to be through being authentic to oneself. And here's the thing, and why Manitoba is so important in this election, and why this is an important issue to all Manitobans, is we have a large Francophone population here. We have a large Anglophone, newcomer population, and an Indigenous population. And if we can't do reconciliation in Manitoba, how are we going to do it in the rest of the country? We should take a leadership role. We should be the ones pushing this forward and saying it is important. And it's not just important to Indigenous peoples. When we're talking about homelessness, we should not wait 8 years, because we see our brothers and sisters from all different cultures who are living in the miniature homes of our bus shelters. And that is an absolute shame. And to wait 8 years to do something about it is far too long, because I was talking about this in 2015. We were talking about this in the mayoral campaign last year, and we're still talking about it. We should be taking action. And it doesn't just impact the people who are downtown in the streets on Main Street. If you are afraid to be downtown, if you are afraid to go downtown at night or to work, that is not a city we should accept in Canada. We are a rich nation, we are a rich province, and we can do things about it. And this is what this platform is about. It's about proposing ideas to actually make a difference in the lives of everyone, no matter where you are. Now, and I know there's lots of other stuff that we've talked about in this platform, the CFS kids who had their money taken from them. But think about that. Imagine if the Manitoba legislature said there was or the court said there's an injustice that happened against you, you're entitled to compensation, and then the Manitoba legislature voted a law saying you could not go back to the courts to get your money from the Manitoba government for that injustice that they caused against you. What would you think about that? But that happened here in Manitoba recently. It is happening today. Yet no one else is taking a position to say it's wrong. And we are the human rights city. We have the Museum of Human Rights in our city, yet no one is taking a stand. What do we want? Do we wish to be a human rights city? Do we wish to live up to the ideals of our ancestors? We came here, many people came here with the Selkirk settlers, and Chief Peg was look after them in friendship, extending a hand. And yet now we have to fight tooth and nail for every little thing, and it becomes political every time we do something, and it shouldn't have to be. It should just be a thing of common decency. Like Shoal Lake with their road, with the clean water for Shoal Lake. These things should be done of a natural course, whether you are Christian, Muslim, whether you're Punjabi, or whether you're Indigenous or from any other culture around the world. When you come here, we are a very rich nation, and we can look after each and every one of us if we just think about how we can actually do this. And I'll just finish with this. We are such a small province. There's only 57 MLAs. But when the two main parties can't talk to each other and use a wedge issue, which involves families in a community such as, the murdered and missing Indigenous women to divide Manitobans and use it in an election campaign, it's frankly wrong. Because it doesn't advance reconciliation. And I know we're coming up to tomorrow is the day. And people are going to be very angry about this. And it shouldn't be a day of where we're angry. It should be a day of healing, of discussion, of learning, of working together. People should be in the churches, in the temples, talking to each other on this weekend about these things. And yet we're not. We're arguing with each other. And with such a small legislature, 57 MLAs, we as a province need to work together, because if we work together, we could actually have a larger impact in all of our nation. And this is why I'm a Liberal. And we've talked about this time and time again. This is not an easy path that any of us have chosen to be in the Liberal Party. If it was an easy path, we would have picked one of the bigger parties where it's easier. But what we desire is, most of all, is this change. We want to make a difference. We want to see our province advance. And so what I'm calling on is Manitobans to think carefully over the weekend about when they're voting. How are we going to advance reconciliation? Because all the parties have a history that they've sometimes failed to recognize. Whether they're the federal Liberals, federal NDP, provincial Conservatives, federal Conservatives, everyone has a history. But how do you hold people's feet to the fire to make sure that they follow through with what they said they're going to do? And that's going to be a big question. And I know there's people here who should be in the Manitoba legislature to have conversations which are constructive, not divisive, not with yelling, not with anger, but actually how can we work together? And if we had a minority parliament, a minority legislature, what might that do for Manitobans to make a difference?